Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Today we are working on the 2015 Dodge Grand Caravan SXT, and we are going to replace the alternator, and it's located right there, so it should be pretty straightforward. Wait, right where? Oh, that's right. It's a transverse installation of this Pentastar engine. So those two nuts right there, those are the two of the three nuts that hold the alternator in place. So we've got a little bit of work to do to get access to it, but in the end it's three nuts to take off and replace the alternator. Um, so it should be relatively straightforward, but it's just a bit of work to get some access. So why are we replacing the alternator? It's a bit of a weird one. So we got back from a 3,500-mile road trip, absolutely no problems with this van. A day or two later, towards the end of the day of running some errands, it showed a P562 code, which is a system voltage low, which is weird. And it also started to be sluggish to start, kind of like the battery was dying. So I took it over to, well, I used my little battery tester on it, and it said that the battery was basically empty. It needed to be recharged. Took it over to AutoZone. They ran their, the better tools that they have on it, and the battery was super low. Um, when the van was running, it was running just fine. So it's kind of weird. So it seemed like maybe it's an alternator charge circuit. So the alternator was running the van fine, but not recharging the battery. So after multiple starts, it was running low and having a hard time starting. So we swapped out the battery since it was nearing the end of the 3-year warranty. We just replaced it under warranty and brand new battery. And then they ran a test on it, and the AutoZone tools showed that the alternator was not recharging the battery. So we think it's the alternator, and we're going to go ahead and replace it. But one last thing I did at home just now before we get into this with the new battery, it shows 12 volts, no problem. Got the van running, and it shows 14 volts at the battery, which is what you'd expect from an alternator that's charging the battery. So I really don't know exactly what's going on. These are kind of hard to diagnose, but we are, it's kind of sucky. The alternators are not cheap, but getting stranded somewhere is even worse. So I'm just going to go ahead, replace the alternator, and hopefully that solves all the problems. We don't get the code again. With respect to that code, I cleared the code and it never came back, even when the battery was even at a lower state of charge. So um, anyway, hopefully this video is helpful to somebody, the diagnosis piece, and then also the actual way of replacing the alternator. And I'm going to hold off on posting this video to let us drive it around for a couple weeks and see if the problem is truly gone, if there's something else going on. And I'll keep you posted on that at the end of the video. So with that long introduction, let's head on into replacing the alternator. Just a quick layout of the work that's ahead of us. We're going to remove the coolant reservoir. We're going to clamp off the upper radiator hose, pull it off the radiator. You're going to get a little bit of coolant leakage, not a whole lot. Definitely not going to drain the entire radiator. We are going to then remove the coolant fan, and the reason for that is because the alternator is going to come up this way when we replace it, and we need the space. By folding the coolant hose up and out of the way, then we'll be able to access the two nuts on top of the alternator and then also the electrical connections. Then we'll go down below, we'll remove the cover that gives us access to the drive belt and the front of the alternator, and we'll take the belt off, we'll take the last nut off, and we should be able to pull the alternator out, do the reverse to reinstall it.
Well, my microphone cut out halfway through recording this video, so I'm going to narrate some of it. First, disconnect your negative battery terminal using a 10mm socket. Next, we're going to remove the upper radiator hose from the radiator. So I'm using my hose pinch-off pliers. I'll leave a link in the video description to clamp off the radiator hose so no fluid comes from the engine out the radiator hose. Then I use a pair of pliers or hose clamp pliers if you've got them to back the spring clamp off so that I can remove the hose. Once you've got the hose clamp backed off, just wiggle the hose. You may need to use a pick to break it free, but just wiggle it back and forth and get it off the radiator. A little bit will drip out, so I have a pan underneath. Then once you get the hose off, you can remove the engine cover if you haven't already. pop the hose retainer off the intake manifold cover and push the hose up out of the way. Now, the hose is still running down to the water pump, and it does a little bit come close to the alternator, which is what I'm pointing at right there, but you'll be able to push the radiator hose out of the way when it comes time to. Now we're going to remove the coolant overflow tank by disconnecting the hose from the neck of the radiator, unclamp it from the top of the fan shroud, and then snake the hose out from underneath the wire harness, lift up on the coolant tank, get it clear of the radiator. It's not a big deal to remove. Now we're going to remove the wire harness from the fan. This is the connector at the top on the passenger side. And then if you look back along the harness, you can see that it's connected to the fan shroud in a couple of places. Mine's already been removed once, so I use zip ties to get it back, because when you take those Christmas tree connectors off, they're probably going to break. So either remove the Christmas tree fasteners that are holding the wire harness onto the fan, or cut your zip ties, or whatever. Disconnect the electrical connector with a red pull tab you need to slide back, and then depress the little button on the connector to get it free. To get the radiator fan off the radiator, you have to push in on these little plastic tabs. There's one on each side, and it is actually what's holding the radiator fan into position behind the radiator. So you're going to push one down and then lift up on the passenger side, and then push the other one in, lift up on the driver's side to get it to come out. So this is what it looks like. You're pushing in the tab and pulling up at the same time just to get it free, and then once it's free, you can start working it out. And it's a little bit of a gymnastics to get it around some of the tubing on one side and some of the plastic on the other side. Just be really slow, careful, gentle. Pull it about halfway up, and then you're going to stop because you've got one more electrical connector you have to disconnect. Just take your time. You don't want to break anything. You see that white connector there? That is what actually did most of hanging up the radiator for me able to pull it free. You just had to massage it and work everything around, just being careful. Get it about halfway up, and now that red connector, the tab of it, there's a connector there right in the middle for the fan motor. And it's easier to get access to it once you pull the fan halfway up, but you just slide that red tab back from the connector, which would be up towards you, and then you can depress the little button or lever inside the connector to release it from the fan. I tried to use a pick or a screwdriver to get that tab to come up, and in the end what worked out best for me was my fingernails. So whatever you need to do to get it free, and you can set the harness aside and pull the fan out from behind the radiator. Now we finally have access to the alternator itself. There's a plastic shield sitting on top of the alternator, so you're going to remove these two nuts with a 1/2 inch or 13mm socket. They're not torqued on very hard, and don't retorque them very hard, but they're just holding that plastic shield in place. Remove them, set them aside, slide that plastic shield out. It comes out pretty easy. Then drop it on the floor, because that's what I'm going to do. Oh, there it goes. Pick it up, show it to the camera, and we're done.
There are two electrical connections you need to disconnect on the top of the alternator, or I guess it would be on the back of the alternator. The first one is the one with the red tab that you slide back, and then it's kind of like a standard connector that you disconnect. Again, use a pick or screwdriver if you need to help get that red tab slid out of the way. To get the second wire off, first you squeeze the tabs on the black plastic cover, squeeze that together, pull the black plastic away. That's the protective cover. And that's another 13mm or 1/2 inch socket to get the nut off and get the wire harness out of the way.
With the connections on the alternator disconnected, you can use a 13mm deep well or a wrench to get the top two bolts on the alternator loose. Don't back them out all the way quite yet.
These are going to be torqued a pretty good amount, so if you have a deep well, that will probably serve you well. Before removing the bolts that hold the alternator to the engine here at the top, I'm going to go underneath the car and remove the belt and get that part of the alternator ready to be removed. Here we are on the passenger side wheel well. Tires obviously off, up on jack stands. This cover has to get removed. There's a trim push pin thing here. What are they called? I don't know. I never remember. Comments, what do we call these people? Anyway, there's one of them here. And then going underneath, flying, making you sick probably. There is another one here. And then flipping you around, this is by the windshield washer reservoir. There's a 10mm there's a bolt there. He uses a 10mm socket, and then one right there, 10mm socket. Zip those off. This plastic cover should come down and show you the engine. All right, welcome to the side, well, really the front of your engine. Now that you have access to it, first do a quick inspection. This is your harmonic balancer. Your front crankshaft seal is right behind here. Always look for some oil. If there's any oil, like the seal might be leaking, now's a good chance to see it. It's hard otherwise to notice. Mine looks great, so not worried about that. This is the tensioner. This is what you're going to be opening so that you can get the belt off. And let's see, where is that alternator? Looking towards the front of the vehicle, and it is right, where'd it go? Right there. You can barely see it. And that's really the only part that makes this job so challenging, is just how hard it is to access. But first thing we need to do is take the belt off. So we are going to use a 3/8 inch ratchet, or maybe a 1/2 inch ratchet with a 3/8 adapter because they're longer. Turn this in the counterclockwise direction. You'll loosen the tension on the belt. You can pull the belt off. You really just need to get it off the alternator, but if you're going to take it off, you may as well take it all the way off so it's not in your way. Once you have the belt out, do yourself a favor. Go along the outside and the inside. Look for cracks, missing segments on the inside, anything like that makes it look old, brittle, that sort of thing, and replace it. If you're due to replace the belt, now's a good time. If you haven't ever done it, you've got 100,000 miles or something on it, be a good time to do it since you're taking it off anyway. I've just recently replaced the belt, so I'm going to reuse the belt, but this is a good project to use an opportunity to replace the belt if you need to. So under the van, looking up at the alternator, you're looking for a nut that has got a stud sticking through it with E7 external Torx on it, and there's one there right under the alternator facing the same direction as the top studs, and then there's this one up here on top of the air conditioning compressor. As inviting as this one looks, it is not the alternator nut. That's the compressor mount. So you want to remove the nut up here on top of the air conditioning compressor. It's would be the bottom left corner of the alternator as you're looking at it from the passenger wheel well. You're going to need a 13mm or a 1/2 inch deep socket to get it off of the stud. Most everybody says you need to remove that stud to get the alternator out. Some people say you can slide the alternator off without doing it. I think that makes it more challenging, and you've got those compressor lines, the AC lines right there. This is not torqued into the block. It is just tight. So I'll leave a link in the video description for the external Torx set that I have, but you just really need to just get a wrench on it and back it off and remove it, and then we can go up to the top and take those two bolts out at the top. Just to show you the stud real quick, it's crazy long, but this is the part that goes into the engine. This is where the alternator sits, and then this is where the nut is, and then this is obviously out in front of the nut. It's a little bit rusty, but this is what it looks like. And then be careful as you're removing the bolts all the last little bit there, so the alternator should come free as well. And then pull that up out of the engine bay, being very careful not to hit the radiator. Of course, the shot of me pulling it out was blocked by my arm where I had the camera, so that's pretty much useless. I'm not going to put it back in, just take it back out again, because it is finesse and a little bit of struggle. So let me just describe to you what's going on. First, the bottom half. So when you're pulling it off the engine and starting to move it up the radiator, that's not a problem. When you get down here, where my finger is, these are the air conditioning lines going to the radiator, the condenser. You start to get a bit of a narrow spot, and then you've also got your dipstick tube right here, and then you have the radiator neck right here. So when I brought it up, first of all, I brought it in this orientation, so the pulley first, and then the two mounting holes toward kind of right between the engine fill and the dipstick. And then I removed the dipstick so I don't break the plastic. and then you just really carefully, and you're the other side of this alternator is really right almost up against the radiator, so you do have to really be careful. And then you kind of just push the dipstick out of the way just a little bit. You're not bending it, but you're just kind of pushing it out of the way so that this side of the alternator, this side over here, clears the radiator neck. So you're just kind of squeezing it between those spots, and you've also got the oil fill right here. So it does fit, but it's pretty narrow, so just go slow, be careful, and you'll get it out. And of course, putting it back in will go the same way. All right, let's take a look. Old alternator, new alternator. They look the same. They've got the same mounting setup, just like that. The new one comes with a new nut for the back, which is great. One thing to show you on the back of these is that, see if I can make it focus. There's little cutouts on both of them, and that's because the connector, the wire, has a little tab on it, and you got to make sure that the tab goes into one of these slots. That's the only way it'll actually fully seat up against the alternator. The new alternator, I'll leave a link in the video description for the one that I got. Comes with a printout. It's got specs on it. It's got a graph, and it's got squiggly lines on the graph. So that obviously means that it's perfect, and it passed. So whoever decided it passed against whatever criteria, I don't know, but it passed. So that makes me feel better, right? Well, hopefully it works just fine, but it should fit in there just fine. So let's go get it into the van. Now we'll put the new one in the same way the old one came out. I'm going to try to get a different perspective so you can see the manipulation of getting this through the top part of the radiator. And once I get it down to the alternator, I'm going to try to get, or I will get those two stud bolts started to hold the alternator up against the engine. We'll go ahead and install those bolts at the top of the alternator, hand tight, not torque them down yet, not really tighten them up yet, and then we'll go install that stud on the bottom. All right, so remember the dirty end of the stud faces you. We'll go ahead and insert it and then screw it in, and it's just going to be hand tight. You don't need to torque it down. When you torque the nut, that will actually torque this stud in as well. So just get this in there and tighten it just a little bit with a wrench. So my torque wrench is a 1/2-inch drive, and I would have to use a 1/2-inch to 3/8 adapter plus the deep socket, and that stack up is too big to fit inside the radiator. So I'm going to use my inch-pound torque wrench, and 18 foot-pounds is 216 inch-pounds, and I will torque it that way. Now we'll put the nut on that stud on the bottom, torque that to 18 foot-pounds or 216 inch-pounds as well. It is so hard to get video in here. I tried, guys, but I couldn't get video of the torque wrench and everything going at the same time. So I did torque it. Trust me, if it makes you feel better, it went something like this. Click. And then I tried it again, and it went click. While we're down here, let's go ahead and put the belt back on the engine. I'm going to leave, I'm going to insert a graphic right now, and this shows you how the belt is supposed to go on the engine. So hopefully you can pause the video, take a look at it, screenshot it, whatever you need. I'm not going to be able to really make a video of me installing it because all of these covers that are in the way. But basically just route the belt in the orientation it's supposed to. Make sure the ribs of the belt are over the pulleys, that it's all flush and neat and secure. And then, of course, you've got to open up the tensioner to get the belt to go over all the pulleys. And then you slowly release the tensioner, and that'll hold it in place. To make the connections, electrical connections on the back of the alternator, do the bolt on the back of the alternator first. So you've got the big red wire that's got the tab that we talked about. So you just set that over top of the bolt threads, make sure it's fully seated. Take that brand new nut, tighten it down, but just get a little bit tight. You don't want to over torque it. If you break that bolt that's in the alternator, it's like getting a new alternator. And then put that plastic cap back on so that you've got good protection over that connection. For the other electrical connection, just slide the connector on, Make sure it's fully seated, slide that red tab forward, lock it in place. Now we'll go put that plastic shield back on top of the alternator. Remember, those nuts were not torqued, and so you don't want to torque them down. Just get them nice and snug so it'll hold the plastic shield in place. So now it's time to go put the fan back in, and we know all about the stuff that's up here that it has to go into. You're going to have to wrangle it around the plumbing and all the same things you had to worry about getting it out. But one thing to point out, this is a little shelf. It's on both sides, and that is where the radiator rests into. So you got to make sure the bottom of the radiator goes into these little clips on both sides. If once you think you've got it down, if you can move it away from the radiator, like in this direction towards the engine, then it's not fully seated down here. You're gonna have to pull it back up and try again, because you definitely need to get both of the bottoms seated. Then once you get that all seated, then you just make your electrical connections, those two wire connections on the back of the fan motor and the back of the fan itself. And then push your push pins back into the fan housing, or use zip ties if you broke those either this time around or sometime previously. With the fan reinstalled, next is to put the overflow tank for the radiator back in. The tank has a couple of bosses on the back of it, and there are keyways in the fan shroud. You just line those up, slide it down, and that'll hold the bottle in place, and then just route the hose back and reconnect it to the neck of the radiator. With the overflow installed, now we'll reconnect the upper radiator hose, and you just want to make sure the clamp goes back right where the impression of it is on the hose. Put it back in the same spot with your pliers or your tool. And I'll have to say, these hose clamps, and I'll leave a link for them in the video description, these are great. There were 0 drops of fluid lost when I took that apart, and I don't have to worry about anything with the coolant system, having done this alternator replacement. All that's left to do is put the engine cover back on, reconnect the negative terminal on the battery, start the van, and first just make sure it starts and runs and the belt doesn't get destroyed, the engine still works, all that stuff. And then I'll check the voltage at the battery to see if it's 14 volts coming from the alternator. But other than that, there's really not much I can do other than drive it around for a couple weeks and hope it doesn't die, and tell me that the alternator is working just fine, and that whether or not that solved the problem. Hey everybody, here's an epilogue. Wearing a different shirt because it's a couple days later, and I just went and replaced the alternator again. That one that I installed in the video, it showed 14 volts at the battery for just a few minutes. We took it for a short drive, and the battery indicator light came on the instrument panel, and there's only 12 volts going to the battery from the alternator. I double checked my work. Alternator was installed, connected correctly, good continuity. It just wasn't working. So I returned that alternator, got another one, same part, same vendor, TRQ, installed it, and it's working great. I've got it running just to keep an eye on it for a while, but it is showing 14 volts at the battery for longer than the other one was. And it took me about an hour and 20 minutes to replace it the second time. So if you gotta do it more than once, you can do it a lot faster the second time, but yeah, really not happy that the first one checked out. I'm gonna throw up a photo comparison of the pass test results between the two alternators. They're basically the same as far as I can tell. But anyway, I don't want to, not tell you guys the whole story, show you the whole truth. So I did have to put a second alternator in here in just a couple days. Great thing about Amazon, you can do returns and they will ship you one right away. They don't have to get the part back first. So yeah, it sucks, but at least it looks like it's in good shape now. So thank you for watching. Hopefully the video's been helpful. Drop thoughts comments, hallucinations, delusions, whatever. Drop it in the comments. Hit the thumbs up button if you like the video, because that really helps me a lot. And if you're not a subscriber, which most of you are not, you made it this far, consider subscribing. There's lots of good content out there, and I'm really trying to build the channel to the next level. I don't know, but any support you've got is helpful. Thanks for watching. Until the next video, y'all take care and have a good one.